Section 1 of Rambles in New Zealand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswax Candle. Rambles in New Zealand by Carne Bidwill. Dedication. To the Right Honourable the Earl of Devon. To your Lordship, as Governor of the Plymouth New Zealand Company, I beg most respectfully to inscribe the following pages, not with any idea that they will confer honour on your Lordship, but that your Lordship's public and private character may obtain for them a favourable introduction. I venture to believe they will add something to the little stock of information respecting the rising and important colony of New Zealand, and on this ground alone, I trust, be not unworthy of your Lordship's notice. I have the honour to subscribe myself most respectfully, your Lordship's most obedient and very humble servant, John C. Bidwill, June 1841. Preface. It is a very common practice among bookmakers of the present day to entertain their readers with a preface, setting forth with coquettish diffidence not the merits but the demerits of their productions. If they believed their own professions and their diffidence were anything but feigned, it is obvious they would never have entered the list of authors and done their best to make as much waste paper as the rest. It is not my intention to follow their example. But in order to secure my readers as much as possible against the chances of disappointment, I at once assure them most frankly that the following pages have no pretension to literary fame, but were hastily thrown together during my rambles, and have since been deprived, by my arduous occupation as a merchant in Sydney, of whatever improvement a careful revision might have enabled me to effect. The only claim, therefore, I have on the attention of my readers is found on a desire to add something to the little stock of information respecting New Zealand, which, amidst the general interest immigration has excited in England, obtains no ordinary share of consideration. Divested of the usual traveller's licence, fidelity in narrative and attentive observation may safely be depended on, and I have some confidence, having wandered farther in this colony than any other European who has communicated his information to the public, that no one will rise from the perusal of this pamphlet dissatisfied with the trifling amount of money and time it may have cost him. J. C. Bidwill, Sydney, August the 25th, 1840. I arrived at Sydney in September 1838, and soon received the first of those useful lessons which disappointment teaches. I allude to the system observed in the sale of Crown lands, which, instead of being surveyed and ready for auction so that the emigrant may commence operations with undiminished capital, compels him to waste months in idleness and expense ill adapted to the cultivation and advancement of a new colony. As the spot I had selected was at a considerable distance from Sydney, and the time to be wasted between the application and sale proportionately long, I determined to render it as little irksome and unprofitable as possible by rambling in search of information. With this view, I embarked in one of the small schooners which are constantly trading between Sydney and the Bay of Islands, made the northwest Cape of New Zealand on the 4th of February 1839, and the next day arrived in the bay. The whole coast appeared very barren, having no other vegetation than bushes and fern. It is much broken and of a dark-coloured volcanic rock. In some places the earth on the surface is of a bright yellow or red, and apparently of an ochreous nature. The Bay of Islands, a place of late become so familiar in England from various causes, but chiefly from the panorama of it exhibited in London. Footnote. It may perhaps be said that the bay is a place of great resort for shipping, whalers in particular, and that this is the cause of its celebrity, not the panorama. But the island of Wahoo, one of the Sandwich, is very much more so and has 10 times the number of European residents, a paper, theatre, hotels and warehouses, and yet its name is hardly known in England, because as yet there has been no panorama of Wahoo. End of footnote. Is certainly a very pretty place, but in my opinion no more. It is, like Sydney, or rather Port Jackson, entirely deficient of background, so essential to the picturesque. The panorama is exceedingly like the place, with the exception that the hills are trifling elevations in reality, while in the painting they appear very considerable. And one in particular, an island to the northward, seems quite a mountain, although I do not suppose it can be 700 feet high. Can only account for the artist having painted the bay in preference to many other far more beautiful and extraordinary scenes to be found on the island, by the supposition that when he was there it was considered to be the only safe place in the country, and that he was prevented by the unfavourable reports of the people he saw from travelling much into it. Had he painted some parts of the Thames, for instance, he might have produced a picture which, without exaggeration, would have represented such a combination of the grand and beautiful in scenery as is ready to be found in any country. A close piece of water, as large as the bay, thickly studded with islands of every variety, some merely high basaltic rocks, others beautiful low islets covered with trees and grass, and almost surrounded by beaches, while the surrounding shores are everywhere covered thickly with timber, and the hills piled over each other until they are sometimes lost in the clouds. In one place particularly, immediately behind the harbour of Waiho, there are 4 ranges rising one behind another, the highest of which cannot be less than 4,500 feet, and covered with wood to the very summit. To return to the bay. The country around is hilly, and may be said to be nothing but a succession of gullies, rendering the use of wheel carriages of any kind, except perhaps ox carts, almost impracticable. The soil is clay, produced by the decomposition of the lavas and other volcanic rocks, of which the whole of this part of New Zealand is formed. It is bad, that is to say, as bad as any soil can be in a climate so moist and temperate as that of New Zealand. I have, it is true, notwithstanding, seen some very good vegetables grown in the gardens, but as these gardens are always in the small level spots in the vicinity of the gullies, their produce is no criterion of the general goodness of the soil, as such spots receive the whole riches of the surrounding hills, and for agricultural purposes would be totally unavailable from their small size. There are but 2 spots about the bay where towns could be built. One, the site of the village of Tongariro, notorious at present for containing, I should think, a greater number of rogues than any other spot of equal size in the universe, and the other on the opposite side of the bay near the missionary settlement, Paihia. The first of these is the best shelter for shipping, but is entirely cut off from the supply of the country, being situated on an almost insulated neck of land, having the bay in front and the ocean about half a mile distant behind. It is besides so confined that the part available for building purposes could not contain more than a couple of thousand inhabitants, even though the streets were planned with the regularity and closeness of European streets, instead of the straggling manner in which those of a new country are generally built. The other place is a good situation for a town, having a considerable flat space at the mouth of a river navigable for small vessels for a short distance, and being on the land side of the bay is a more fit emporium for the produce of the country, as well as more convenient for merchandise. I do not by any means consider the bay the place where a settlement should be formed, as the whole of the northern part of the island is a mere neck of land, in comparison with that to the southward of the Thames, and nearly the whole of it, if not owned, is at least claimed by Europeans, whereas south of the Thames there have been scarcely any purchases, and the land, instead of being a succession of barren hills and ravines, is full of rich plains and tablelands. I had determined, if possible, to penetrate to those high mountains in the interior of the North Island, which are shadowed forth on the maps and described in the book of the New Zealand Association, and fortunately found a small schooner of 10 tons ready to sail for the southward the day after my arrival in the bay. I accordingly went on board, and as our course was close along shore during the whole voyage, had an excellent opportunity of seeing the coast, which is generally exceedingly beautiful. There are a great many islands scattered along the coast, many of which bear marks of recent volcanic eruptions, the lava on some being quite fresh, and one, White Island, is even at present an active volcano continually smoking, and chiefly composed of sulphur and pumice. The outline of the coast is exceedingly broken. Generally the cliffs are high, but rarely perpendicular, and until after passing the Thames, all are of a dark colour without a trace of stratification. Several of the hills are said by the natives to have lakes on their summits, probably the craters of extinct volcanoes. Another thing which they state is, however beyond my power of belief, that one of these lakes has plenty of saltwater fish in it, and among the rest, sharks. I should have liked very much to have ascended some of these hills, had it been merely to see if there were really any fish in the lakes, either belonging to salt or fresh water. It appears, however, that the very existence of these lakes is a mere matter of tradition, as none of the present generation have ever ascended to their shores, through fear of the nankras, or imaginary centipedes, or crocodiles, for it does not appear very clearly which is meant by the term, which inhabit the banks of all these inaccessible lakes, and with which even whole valleys are said to be so infested that it is impossible to get a native to visit them. After passing the Thames, the cliffs become white and look like chalk. They are, however, of a compact volcanic stone, very good for building, more especially at Mercury Bay, where a gentleman who has resided there for some years has worked a sufficient quantity of it to build a wharf. Perhaps the first wharf built of hewn stones in Australia, those in Sydney being chiefly built of wood. Mercury Bay is a very good harbour for ships of any size, but the country around is very mountainous, and the river running in at the head of the bay so small as to be only fit to turn a mill, the purpose to which it is about to be applied by the gentleman who has purchased the whole country in that neighbourhood from the natives. If he ever gets it to work, it will pay well, and will be the only one worked by water power in Australia. The kauri, or pine of the country, Dammara australis, is abundant here, although it is almost the southern limit of its growth. The kauri adheres to the general predilection I have observed in all true pines for bad land. It always grows on steep clayey hills, but does not form entire forests containing no other tree like the pine forests of America. I have indeed seen but one small patch of land on which the greater part of the trees was kauri. In most of what is here called kauriland, the trees are often 1/4 of a mile asunder, and rarely closer than 100 yards. It is, in my opinion, the least beautiful of the pine tribe, especially in its young state, which is in general the most beautiful age of the pine. In fact, until it gets 30 feet high, it is absolutely ugly. It retains the appearance of a regular coniferous tree until it becomes about 18 inches in diameter, when it begins to change, and after that period ceases to resemble the rest of its tribe in the slightest degree. It often resembles in outline an oak, but from the excessive paucity of its foliage can never vie with that tree in beauty. I apprehend there is not the slightest chance of it growing in England, as it is not found more than 40 miles south of the Thames in New Zealand. It will be seen, from what I have said, that people have been greatly deceived in England with regard to the supply of kauri spars, etc., to be derived from New Zealand. Not only is the portion of country on which it grows very limited, but the labour of getting the timber out of the forests is immense, because of the wonderfully hilly nature of the country. And in New Zealand there is no snow to assist with the dragging of the weight, as in those countries from whence the present supply of timber is chiefly derived. I had intended to start from Mercury Bay for the interior, but when I arrived there, I found, from the information given me by Mr. Brown of that place, who is probably better acquainted with New Zealand and more particularly with the people than any other person, that it would not be the proper place. I therefore went on to Tauranga, which is at present the last mission station to the southward, and from thence eventually started on my voyage of discovery into the unknown regions of New Zealand. Tauranga is a harbour unfit for large vessels, but was, during the time of the flax trade, a place of some consequence, as very large quantities of that article were collected there. At present no flax is grown, as pigs supply the wants of the natives with infinitely less trouble to themselves. The coast here, and for a considerable distance to the southward, is low and level with sandy beaches. One side of the entrance to the harbour is formed by a curious hill, or immense rock of basaltic lava mixed in some places with pumice. It is of a conical or irregular pyramidal form, and about 600 feet high. Standing as it does entirely alone in the middle of a great extent of low-level coast, forms a very striking object, whether viewed from sea or land. It was formerly a very strong pa, a native fort or village, for the word means either. I should observe, however, that all the villages are fortified by a ditch and stockade. The land sides of the hill are terraced from top to bottom, and must have been inhabited for a very long period, as the greater portion of the soil of which the terraces are formed is composed of cockle shells. At present the Tauranga tribe is a very small one, and will most likely in 2 or 3 years cease to exist, as at present its only support is that of another tribe, the Waikato, which is the largest in the country, but they are a very bad set. This tribe, the Waikatos, is at war with the Rotorua tribe, which latter occupies the land behind the Tauranga tribe and a port called Makatu, about 20 miles to the east along the coast. The Waikatos have no port on the eastern shores, and have for some time been trying to get possession of Makatu. They seized it once while I was on my journey, but were beaten off again by the Rotorua people. It appears probable that they will pick a quarrel with the Tauranga people as a pretext for dispossessing them of their territory, which would be more convenient for them than Makatu, that place being farther off, and the tribe one of the most warlike, if not the most powerful in the country. About 6 weeks before I arrived at Tauranga, a small party started from Rotorua and, lying in wait near Tauranga, seized a number of people, about 20 I believe, and cooked them, absolutely in sight of the different villages. The place was just at the base of the great hill I have spoken of, Manganori, and when I visited it I saw all the native ovens, copper mauris, according to English pronunciation, in which the cooking had been performed, and a portion of the entrails, etc., was strewn about. My companion called me to see a head which was then half eaten by the dogs, but I had seen enough for that day and did not follow him. This head was removed by the missionaries as soon as they heard of it, and buried, so that when I visited the place afterwards, every vestige of the late horrid tragedy had disappeared. There are 2 things well worthy of note in this occurrence, as being totally opposed to English ideas of the New Zealanders. The first is that a whole tribe should suffer less than 100 men to come into the heart of their country, where they, the invaders, were surrounded on all sides, and stay 10 days or more, killing all the stragglers they could find, confining the rest in their paths, and even paddling about the harbour in their canoes in the middle of the day, without making the least show of resistance. And the second, that the natives who perpetrated this massacre and cannibalism in cold blood are not a wild, untutored race who had never had intercourse with Europeans, or with Europeans, were such as are a disgrace to the countries whence they spring, such as those by whom the natives of the Bay of Islands and other places to the north would have been contaminated, but on the contrary, have enjoyed the advantage of the residence of missionaries among them for several years, and those missionaries too amongst the most active and zealous of any in New Zealand. Indeed, there have been few white men among them, with the exception of missionaries, more especially for the last 2 or 3 years since the murder of the last trader who lived there, which has prevented others from supplying his place. Neither is the general bravery or hardihood, or very great improvement in the body of the New Zealanders, so much talked of in England, very strikingly developed in these proceedings. Footnote: I do not wish to undervalue the labours of the missionaries, but my business is to state facts, and to warn people against forming too hasty conclusions respecting the good that may be done by them. End of footnote. The country about Tauranga, for about 10 miles inland, is almost a perfect level covered with fern. The land is not bad, as it is light and contains a good proportion of undestroyed vegetable matter, which becomes apparent when it is stirred. I have seen very good clover and grass growing in the garden of the mission, or I might perhaps have thought the land was much worse than it is. Cannot indeed be called rich, as the constant destruction of the fern by fire is sufficient to impoverish any land, but in the long run the light soils covered with fern will be preferable for agriculture to the clayey forest lands where the kauri grows, which are in general the only lands that have hitherto been the objects of purchase by Europeans, if the terms by which they claim them can be called purchasers, or if indeed the natives have any real idea of selling their lands, which at present I doubt. There is going on at Tauranga a formation of coal which is very curious. It is in some places about a foot thick, and although quite recent and containing nothing but the leaves, etc., of the living plants of the country, it is regularly separated by layers of soft earth of just the colour and appearance which the clayey strata of the coal measures present, although entirely formed of partially decomposed pumice, which is also the basis of the entire soil of this part of the island, becoming very apparent when the natives, by constant planting of sweet potatoes, etc., near the villages, have exhausted all the vegetable part of the soil. The influenza, which had just visited New Zealand, had hardly left Tauranga, and in consequence of the general sickness, joined to the war between the two places, I had great difficulty in getting any natives to go with me from Tauranga to Rotorua. I should have been entirely stopped had it not been for the great kindness of the missionaries, who persuaded some of the lads attached to their establishment to go with me. To one of these gentlemen, in particular, Mr. Stack, I shall always feel under obligation, as he assisted me greatly to his own inconvenience, the natives being so generally ill that when I took the lads belonging to his household, it was impossible for him to get any more to supply their places, which in ordinary times would have been easy. I was obliged to take these natives because they happened to be related to the Rotorua tribe, and consequently could go there without any danger of being put into a copper Maori when they arrived. I learnt a curious fact relating to the politics of New Zealand in consequence of the circumstance. It appears that if two tribes are at war and the chief of most consequence in one tribe were to marry the only daughter of the corresponding rangatira of the other, that would not do anything towards making peace between the two tribes, but the two individuals only would observe neutrality. And this is the more curious, as females can really hold property, and are in fact chiefs as well as the men. There is a case in point between the Waikato and Rotorua tribes at the present moment. It is a striking instance of the want of real power in the chiefs, as were there any real government, such a marriage could not fail to unite the tribes under one head, or at all events to render them allies. After several days' delay from the above-mentioned causes, I got ready for the journey, and set out for Rotorua with 7 natives to carry luggage, and a white man as interpreter. I should have not wanted so many natives, had it not been for the great weight of their food, which consists almost entirely of potatoes. One, in fact, went solely to carry food for the first day's journey, and left us next morning. End of section 1.